because the last thing we need is one more division in the body of
Amen.
Christ.
That's right.
I think we're full up with those. We got, there's a no vacancy sign on conflict in the church. We're plenty. So I really want to be able to emphasize that. And yeah, I think we need to switch it from big learning, small learning from big only, to unhealthy learning from healthy. Now, within that, unhealthy big churches are going to learn more from healthy big churches, and unhealthy small churches are going to learn more from healthy small churches, because there is a difference in the way they're pastored. But that doesn't mean that that's exclusively it. Unhealthy big churches can also learn from healthy small, and unhealthy small can also learn from healthy big. But it should be primarily healthy to unhealthy rather than from big to small. That's good.
Hey, thank you so much for joining the Revitalized Church podcast. Today I'm joined by special co-host Pastor Brian Wible. Pastor Brian pastors in Kenly, North Carolina, and together we're going to interview Pastor Karl Vaters. He's a renowned author, and today we're going to talk about his latest book, De-Sizing Church. This book is important because it allows pastors and leaders to look at their organizations through the right metrics and not just by the money coming in and the people sitting in the seats. So stick around, stay tuned, and I hope that you'll learn something about how you can apply it to your church, how it applies to you, and how, if we look at things properly, we might see church health in a different way than we've always seen before. And that's what this is all about, finding ways to improve our church, to lead to the best of our ability, and share the knowledge that you have. So thank you for tuning in, and I join now with Pastor Brian and Pastor Karl. Hey, thank you, Pastor Karl, for joining in with us today. It's very exciting for me to have you on here. I've been reading your material. I am a huge fan. As you can see, we got Brian Wible right in between us today, so we're thankful to Brian. Brian's the one that introduced me to your material, so I thought it would be great to have him here today to join the conversation. We're both small church pastors, and we consider ourselves healthy small church pastors. Our churches are doing good, and we've used a lot of your material for that. So thank you for being here. If you wouldn't mind, take just a second, welcome everybody, and tell them a little bit about who Karl Vaters is.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for the invitation, Will, and thank you for the introduction, Brian. That's very, very kind of you. Yeah, it's really an honor to be with you today. I know the podcast is fairly new and you're just getting started, and I'm always grateful for more voices within this cycle. So I'm actually a third generation pastor, and my grandfather was a pastor, my dad was a pastor, and I've been a pastor for over 40 years now. And I was taught how to pastor. I was maybe the last class, one of the last classes that was taught the old school way before the church growth movement really hit heavily in the mid to late 80s. So I graduated in January of 1981. So I got my Bible college education in the late 1970s, early 80s. Yes, I'm that old.
I was born in 80.
What's that?
I was born in 80.
Yeah, well, there you go. So if I might have babysat you. I don't know. So anyway, but I was raised I was taught the way my dad was taught, the way my grandfather was taught, as a kind of a pastoral presence. That was how I was taught. And then within 5 years of me graduating, the church growth movement came in like a tornado. I mean, it just came in and it was everything. And I loved what they were saying. And so I kind of disassembled what I had been taught and reassembled it into the church growth paradigm. And there were a whole lot of really good things about that, things that needed a change in emphasis, being more missional and outward looking, and, attaching some metrics and counting that we'd never done before. So there was a lot of it that was very good. But after 25 years of attempting to do what the church growth movement was telling us to do, I didn't get any of the results that they basically, it felt to me like they were guaranteeing. Mm-hmm. And I looked around and went, okay, it must just be me, because everybody else seems like this is working for them. And I went through a real season of doubting my call, never doubting my faith, but doubting my call, until I started looking around and realizing, wait a minute, it seems like there's a whole lot of us out here that are doubting our call because we're not hitting the numbers. And as I started doing the research, I realized that, in fact, maybe about 10% of pastors, the church growth stuff was really working for them. But for the vast majority of us, like 80 to 90% of us, were like, this stuff just isn't kicking in like it's supposed to for us. And so I started looking at it and going, okay, if something is out there and it's working for 90% and failing for 10, then you look at the 10 and go, let's see if we can fix you. But if it's working for 10% and not working for 90, then you got to look at the material itself and go, maybe that's where the problem is.
Yeah.
And so I started to realize that, wait a minute, getting bigger is not, first of all, the goal of the church. And secondly, it's not where God calls most churches to go in order to do the ministry he called us to do. So I started looking around and realizing, okay, if 90% of the churches in the world are under 200, serving half of the body of Christ, then maybe this isn't part of a problem to fix. Maybe this is part of God's strategy. So let's figure out how to tap into that part of his strategy, in addition to the churches that are getting bigger, in addition to the churches that are large. Let's see what the small church has to offer. And so for the last 11 years now, since I wrote my first book, The Grasshopper Myth, that's been what this ministry has been about, is encouraging and resourcing the small, vibrant, healthy church.
Yeah, and I like that. And so it's not a either or, like you've got to be small or you've got to be a large church. And I like that you bring that out in your book, that we want all churches to be healthy. You can learn something from a healthy church, regardless of the size. It can be a big church, it can be a small church, but we can learn something. Like, I like to think that I'm doing things here at my church that somebody can learn from. And so you kind of bring that out, that health is health. It's not a numerical issue. So where did we go wrong? You talked a lot in your book about the church growth movement in there. And one of the things that I pulled out that kind of hit home with me was the entrepreneurial spirit that a lot of pastors had during that. And it got a little bit misguided. So for somebody like me that's constantly, I'm very driven. I want to see us do a lot of things, and I love new ideas. How do we rein that in to make sure we're doing it the right way?
It's a really important question to ask, because so much of what I read from church growth material in the last few years, especially, it is completely pro-entrepreneurial and sometimes even anti-simple pastoral presence. Like, there've been a couple articles, stop being a shepherd and get on the entrepreneurial chain. And I'm like, stop being a shepherd. The word pastor literally means shepherd. So,
right.
And I'm like you too. I'm entrepreneurial as well. I pastored for 41 years. I now do this full time. I've got a podcast. I've got a blog. I write books. I speak at conferences. You don't do that if you're not entrepreneurial. I am aggressively entrepreneurial. I really enjoy that aspect of it. But it does have to be, and if you're an author, then just be entrepreneurial. And if you're just a podcaster, then just be entrepreneurial. But if you're a pastor, the word pastor itself means shepherd. And so, and then again, if 90% of the churches in the world are small churches, if we're looking at that as a problem to fix, then we're constantly putting 90% of pastors in a place where they feel like they're failing on a constant basis. And how in the world are they going to get vibrant and healthy and strong if they can't get their numbers up, and that convinces them that they're not doing it right? If, on the other hand, we look at it and go, okay, maybe this 90% of the church is being small is part of God's strategy. And if it is, then maybe part of his strategy is that most pastors are called to be pastoral. Most pastors are called primarily to be shepherds, not ranchers, to be hands-on pastors and not entrepreneurs. Now, you can do the hands-on pastoring and still have an entrepreneurial spirit, still want to improve and still want to try new things and experiment with new ideas, and making sure you're keeping up with language that people understand rather than just simply getting stuck into old ruts. So there should always be a freshness to what we do. But I think we need to redirect our entrepreneurial spirit, and it needs to go away from getting the numbers up and into how do we go deeper. I use a phrase that I like to call transition without relocation. Transition without relocation. So if you're going to be in a church for a long term, you need to be constantly growing in your faith, and you're going to walk through transitional phases while staying at your current church without transitioning into a new church. For years when I was younger, every time I would hit a roadblock, I go, well, I guess God is calling me somewhere else. And I've found out, no, most of the time he's not calling me somewhere else geographically. He's calling me to go deeper in my pastoral understanding, or maybe even to switch the way that I pastor. I changed the way I preach, I think 5 times in the 40 years I was pastoring, 5 or 6 times. I made a major shift in the way I was preaching because the old way wasn't the language people were speaking anymore. So yes, we can be entrepreneurial, but it needs to be as a way of going deeper and expressing the gospel in fresh language rather than just simply getting the numbers up or rather than relocating to another geographical place.
Yeah, and that's one thing I mean you really hit on. I think you kind of just elaborated on in my own life, and I can see it is my worst enemy was not everybody else. It is myself being comfortable in my own calling. When I walk in a room full of pastors, not walking in feeling inferior because I'm pastoring, 30, 40, 100 or whatever, feeling like, oh, like we walk around with a number hanging on our chest. Well, who are you? Oh, I'm 60. Who are you? Oh, you're 1,500.
Yeah.
And so, but once I learned that just to be faithful in my calling to who I am, and where God placed me, it was almost like the pressure, like the elephant was off my chest, so to speak.
Yeah.
And just being comfortable in my giftings, my abilities, realizing there's areas I am weak in, there's areas I need help in, or what you just said. I love that. Transitioning without relocation. Leaving's not always the answer. But I think what you just said, if we could figure out a way for guys or men or women to not feel like a failure just because your numbers, and that's why I think your books and your material, like I was telling you earlier, you're saying what nobody else is really saying, that you can be successful in a small church, being healthy, doing the ministry. But like I said, I learned my biggest defense was it was me more than everybody else. Nobody put that on me. I just felt like that. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
And that feeling you're describing is the absolute starting point for this entire ministry of helping small churches thrive. The title of my first book is The Grasshopper Myth, which is a strange title, but it comes from the book of Numbers where the 12 spies go into the land, 10 of them come back with a negative report, and the basis of their negative report is not that the land wasn't plentiful and rich and beautiful and that God wasn't giving them a great place. It was the opposite. It was, wow, this is too much for us. Look at those giants. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So the whole premise of it is, if you can get over this grasshopper myth, that you are a grasshopper and simply know where God has placed you and what God is taking you into, that changes your perspective on everything. But we start with this looking around and seeing bigger places and think, well, I'm not much compared to them. And then here's the deal. If you're convinced that small is a problem, or if you're convinced that God can use small, whichever one you're convinced of, you will be right. If you think small is a problem, it will be a problem for you. If you're convinced that God can use small no matter what, then you will be able to be used while you're small. It starts with that mindset shift that we've all got to make.
I was just listening to a podcast a little while ago with Greg Rochelle and Dr. Axe. So he is Dr. Axe is somebody that helps out with different food, nutrition. He's got a big business in selling that kind of stuff. He gives a lot. He's just written a book he put out there. And he had that same conversation with Craig Rochelle. He said, if you believe that you can heal, you'll heal. He said, that's why doctors' bedsides manner is so important. They've got to impress upon the patient that you can be healed. He said, but if they don't, if that person leaves without that thought process, he said, but there are things, and he used a lot of terminology that I can't use, that your brain produces when it believes it can heal. It starts automatically sending things to that extremity to heal it. It's the same thing with us as pastors. If we think, hey, this is all I'll ever be, and this is it, and this is, I'm struggling here, and it's constantly a battle. And you talked about that, about the frustration that pastors are going through. You said the more that we hear those numerical numbers, the more and more frustrated we get. And the more we hear, I just had another interview that hasn't aired at the time of this recording. And that pastor said, we go to camp meetings and we go places. And that's the first question we ask is, what are you running now? And Brian, it's funny you said about that number on your chest. He even suggested, why don't we just get lanyards and just put our church number on there and just walk around with the lanyard, and we don't even have to ask anymore. You just look up and you're like, hey, there's Will Earp, 50, All right, you know what I'm saying? There's such and such, this number. I added to the number, let's at least color code it or something. He said, that way we know where to get in line. He said, because in our minds, we're already putting ourselves in a certain order because that guy is pastoring over 200. This guy is only pastoring 10. You know what I'm saying? And so, this is where I fit in because of my number. So if we're going to rank ourselves, let's do it right. And so let's go ahead. I love that idea of go and get the lanyards ready, or let's just throw that out and just say, hey, how you doing? How's your health?
There you go.
Because I don't think we ask each other that enough. With the frustration that you have comes burnout, comes depression, comes people quitting the ministry. We hear numbers all the time, and they're all over the place about how many ministers are quitting the ministry, and it's because they're driving themselves crazy, trying to meet goals that God never said met. I haven't seen anywhere in the Bible that it says you need to have this amount of people. I always see where God removed it down. I was just, I'm studying in the book of Judges myself, and he told Gideon, you have too many people. There's more instances of God removing the crowd than adding to it.
Yep. And we tell those stories and we celebrate them from a biblical context, and then we think the opposite about it within our own church context. Right. God kept reducing Gideon's army, and we tell that story. And this is amazing thing that God did by reducing that army down. And then we go, but in the church, we better have more, or you're going to be in trouble. And we've got this weird perspective. There was a survey, I think about a year ago, that came out, and the headline based on the survey was 2/3 of American churches are stuck or in decline. So I read through the article, and basically what it says is 1/3 of the churches in America are increasing in number. 1/3 are about the same numerically over the last decade, and 1/3 are in decline in whatever the period of time was. I don't think it was a decade. Anyway, and I thought, okay, so 2/3 of American churches are stuck or declining. That's one way to write the headline. But with exactly the same stats, you could have written the headline as 2/3 of churches are holding their own or increasing. That's exact. Both of those headlines are true to the stats, but one begins with a negative standpoint of the lack of numerical increase means failure and stuckness. And the other one begins with God can use churches that are staying the same numerically because that's the size that works best for them.
And you put it in your book, stuck is not a number.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a mindset. There are big churches that are growing numerically who are stuck. They are stuck in old ways of thinking. They are stuck in maybe in a celebrity status for the pastor. They are. I've seen churches. We're right now in a really interesting place. Beginning with Robert Schuller retiring from Crystal Cathedral about 15 years or so ago now, and now with Rick Warren recently. Before that, Bill Hybels, and then we're going to come along with the Craig Groeschels and the Andy Stanleys. We've got about a 20 to 25 year window where we are going to watch as the charismatic founding pastor of influential mega churches reach retirement age and start to leave. And we've never had this experience before where we see how these churches are going to transition. And some churches aren't going to transition well because the entire thing is built upon the celebrity pastor. And once the celebrity pastor is removed, the thing collapses. Whereas others are going to not just survive, but thrive because they're not built on the celebrity pastor, even if the pastor is well known, but they actually have a structure and a church beneath it that will outlive the founding pastor. And so the churches that are going to collapse when the founding pastor leaves, and some already have, those are unhealthy churches, even though they were getting massive numeric. They were stuck in the mode of, if that guy's not on the screen, we're in trouble. And so we saw it happen with Mars Hill when Mark Driscoll left. We saw that happen with Crystal Cathedral when Robert Schuller left. We're seeing Willow Creek struggle with the departure and with all the problems around Bill Hybels. And yet we're seeing others like Saddleback, which is in the middle of a transition, which looks like it's going to maintain because there's a church there. There's a strength. It wasn't just about Rick Warren. It was about a strength beneath him. And it's going to be interesting to see that. So size has nothing to do with stuckness. It's really an issue of health rather than size.
Yeah, and that's one thing I was mentioning is, and I love your view. So I guess and what I see is you're taking almost like, I guess, as a higher up bird's eye view of the church scene. Just reading, many of your books, and even, I don't know if everybody realizes, but you have a podcast yourself that you do in the lobby, and just listening to the various places you go, the various countries, dealing with small churches all around the world. You're not only what you're speaking of, if I'm correct, you're not only talking about just the United States.
No.
Just that worldview that I hear, that listening to you, and the knowledge that comes from that, it lets us know. I think most guys, if we're not careful, we get stuck in our own little, town or culture state, and we never see, but we don't realize what you're saying. These numbers you're talking about, it's a worldview, and I don't know if you could speak to that for just a moment.
That's a very important aspect of this. I've been doing this ministry for small churches for 11 years now, and I never dreamed I'd be in the position that I'm in, because I'm in a guy who was 40 years in small churches. But when I wrote The Grasshopper Myth, it instantly took off. The blog instantly took off, because I was scratching an itch that so few people were talking about. And as you said, at the time, I was saying things that literally nobody else had put in print. Since then, there's a group of us coming along, and it's growing, and that's great. There's plenty of room for a lot of folks to do this, because it's a big task ahead. But yeah, in addition to, so here I am in Orange County, California, but I spend an awful lot of time all over this country, and in almost every denomination you can name. And over the last 6, 7, 8 years, actually from the year one, I was invited to Croatia, of all places, and been several places in Europe, and Central and South America. So Australia. So I've spoken in, I think at this point, a dozen or more other countries. And what I do when I go is I do teach, but I spend more time listening and paying attention, because I want to know that what I'm saying isn't just an American perspective, or when I began, even an Orange County, California perspective, which is a really narrow demographic. Like, folks around me in Orange County, we think we've got the rest of the world figured out. Us and New Yorkers are about the most arrogant people in the country. We're convinced if it's not happening in Orange County, just like New Yorkers are convinced, if it's not New York, it doesn't matter. If it's Orange County, it doesn't matter. Like, there is an arrogance to us that's ridiculous. And then I travel around and I realize there's a whole bunch of people in the deep South who go, well, if you're not doing it this way, then it's not Christian either. So everybody's got their arrogance. Everybody's got their viewpoint. Yeah. And it's just wonderful to get outside of this region, to get outside of denominational walls, and to pay attention. And then what I try to do is, when I present something, I try to present something that has worked everywhere. So if I present something from an Orange County standpoint and I do it in Alabama, and they're just staring at me like, what in the world are you talking about? That will not work here. Then I don't share it anywhere anymore, because it's just for me. But if I share it in multiple places, multiple contexts, multiple denominations, and multiple countries, and every place they go, oh, that makes sense here, then I go, okay, now I've got something. This is how, for instance, I got the nerve to title my second book, Small Church Essentials. How did I dare to put the word essentials on the cover? It's because all of this stuff had been crowd tested in every region of the country, in multiple denominations, and in multiple other countries. And that was the stuff that worked everywhere. And the Lord has put me in this weird position where, because there are people who travel regionally to small churches. There are people who travel within a denomination for small churches. And there are people who travel across denomination and cross countries, but not in small churches. They're in only in big places. And I'm in this weird spot where I get to travel cross-denominationally, cross-country, and across different countries, always in small contexts, always boots on the ground. So it's given me a perspective that I never dreamed I would have, and then I try to honor well whatever I write or speak.
I find that would probably make us even better and make you even stronger, is to see the broad picture like that. You talk about it in your book, the American perspective of even the church growth movement was different overseas, and we Americanized it. We put our spin on it about, hey, we're going to make everything bigger, stronger, faster. And so, that perspective just makes it even healthier. The more we know, and we tend to isolate ourselves sometimes. We pick our tribes, we pick our denominations, and that's what we do. And even with this, man, that's why I want to try and reach out and talk to more people. And just like you said, there's more room from us for everybody, all the different podcasts, all the different voices, is to keep the context going. Let's put more content out there to have these conversations, to talk about the taboo ones, about it's all right to be a small church and still be healthy. You know, we need to hear those voices from all the different angles as much as possible, to learn as much as we can, and share as much as we can, and to hear from voices you get to hear from a lot of people. Like you said, you're always in a small context. You got to hear firsthand from what those guys need.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because now recently, when I first started this ministry, I had 3 goals. Goal number 1 was to encourage the small church pastor, the whole grasshopper thing, right? The second goal was to provide as many small church specific resources as I could find, because as we know, 90% of the church leadership resources we read or listen to come from a big church context. And so we need to find more small church specific stuff. And then my third goal was to try to take this message and mainstream it into the larger church body, so that we're not just talking only from small church pastor to small church pastor, but so that denominations and larger conferences and so on can start to realize, hey, we need to include language for the small church pastor in what we're doing. And that's beginning to happen recently, where I'm being invited to larger contexts. The largest one so far was just March of this year. I had a chance to speak at a Congress in Germany, and I spoke to 7,000 pastors in the room, and there were 1,000 pastors watching online.
Wow.
Biggest group I've ever spoken to by a long shot. Like, it was so big. I stood on a stage that is higher than the roof of my church. And I spoke to people. The front row was farther away from me than the back row is in my church.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
I know, right? And I'm talking about the value of small, and I'm looking out at them, and 99% of them are not looking at me. They're looking at my head on a screen.
Right.
So it's called asynchronous communication, right? And I'm speaking in English, being translated by a translator next to me into German. So there's all kinds of, kind of not quite directly things going on. But it was an interesting context for me as a small church pastor to go, okay, what I'm doing right now, it's got a great buzz, and I got a chance to really have some impact to the broader church world. And if I get invited to something like that again, I will take it, because I want to get this message to as many people as possible. But even as I was doing it, I was thinking, as exciting and as fun as this is, there would be something unhealthy about doing this only or even primarily as my means of communication. Mm-hmm. Because while I can teach them, and while this can be an exciting moment, there is a physical distance between me and the congregation and the people I'm talking to. There is an emotional distance between us. And even in the manner in which I'm communicating, they're not even looking at me while I'm talking, and we're in the same room together. And there's something missing in that. Now, at a conference, no problem. I don't have a relationship with them. I'm speaking once, I'm leaving the country. So, it kind of works in that context. But if that was church every week, right. Now, there's a lot of churches that do that, and then they have the small group, and the small group is where they get to know people and where they're pastored and where they're discipled, and that works in a whole lot of places. A lot of big churches work really hard at making sure that happens, but you've got to recognize that the kind of intimacy and discipleship and personal connection that the church demands for discipleship is not going to happen if all you're getting is a big room like that. You've got to have the small as well. But in the small church, you can get it on Sunday when you go there as well. So I'm getting a perspective now that I'm just starting to learn about how to adapt to that situation, but I'm also seeing some of the real dangers of it as well.
Yeah, no, matter of fact, since you had, I don't want to go in a different direction, but what you just said was because I still have PTSD, from COVID. I share that a lot, as a pastor, all the different things that were thrown at us and just trying to learn. But what you just said, how it affected, and I heard you say that in one of your podcasts, it affected larger churches differently than it did small churches. And it was the intimacy side of it. It was that where we're used to being, the 30 or 40 gathering, or even 100 on a personal level, that, where a larger church, it was not that big a deal to switch to online. And I think that there's the benefit of a smaller church is just what you just said, the closeness and intimacy, and I think that's part of what the DNA is, why maybe there are so many small churches.
Yeah, I'm convinced. Again, if we approach it as a problem, then I think we're going to miss the blessings. We look around and we go, 90% of churches are small, and when that's presented from a church growth standpoint, typically it's okay. How do we fix this problem? Or we can look at it and go, maybe the reason 90% of churches are small isn't because they're all broken, but because that's how God gifted 90% of pastors to do pastoring. We're called to do the hands-on pastoring, and you can't do it once it gets bigger. And I've also noticed this, and this is just a fairly recent thing that I want to follow up on as I pay attention to it, but I know that it's true. I just have to figure out the details behind it. For most churches that grow extremely large, there are points where they hit a natural size that works for them by simply doing good ministry. And then to get through that, they now call it a barrier. To get through that barrier, they have to do things that I'm convinced are artificial. So naturally, maybe the church grows to 50 or grows to 200. Occasionally, you'll get a church that naturally goes to 500 or 600 or so on. And once in a very, very rare situation, you'll get a church that naturally grows into the thousands. It just happens and you can't stop it. But the vast majority of churches that get to extremely large sizes, if you listen to the growth story that these pastors tell, they will talk about hitting barriers where they had to shift things in a way. And as I listen to it, I go, so they're shifting away from the natural thing that God is just doing into a way that feels very artificial to me in order to be able to get to the next level. And at a certain point, somebody needs to stop and go, wait a minute. Why don't we just let the natural thing happen? Why do we feel like we have to impose something artificial on it in order to get to the next level? And I haven't even really fully defined what that artifice is.
Yeah.
But
I can see
as
that.
I say it, as I say it, and as I share it with anybody who hears it goes, yeah, there is something that feels like that about it. In fact, on my podcast, The Church Lobby, one of my recent guests is Dave Gibbons from here in Orange County. And Dave had a church that was growing really, really fast. And he looked around and he realized everybody in the room looks the same. And he said, I'm going to physically move the church to an underrepresented area with people who don't look like us. And he lost at one point over 60% of his congregation. And today it is not nearly as big as it was like 12, 13, 14 years ago or whenever, when he started making these changes. But if you go to that church today, New Song Church in Orange County, it is the most diverse congregation, one of the most diverse congregations I've ever been in. Brooklyn Tabernacle would be another one, amazingly. And you've got people from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. You've got people who are very wealthy and very poor. You got people coming in recovery. You got somebody over here with, covered with tats and scars and piercings and literally lives on the street. And somebody over here also with tats and piercings, but who is running a Fortune 500 company. Right, and they're sitting together, and they're of different ethnic backgrounds and different languages spoken. And they had to lose 60% of their congregation to go from everybody looks like us and everybody is the same at socioeconomic status to let's reach the misfits and the marginalized and let's see what that happens. But sometimes when you choose to go the hard way of discipleship, you're going to lose people for a bit, and we have to be ready to make those decisions if that's necessary. And
that falls down to the leader. You talk a lot about at the end of the book about integrity of our leaders. About we've got to be who God created us to be. We've got to be genuine about that. So how does that integrity to play in, of who we are to our people? Are we being integral to what Scripture's called us to be? So what does that look like?
Yeah. So in desizing the church, the first third, I talk about this, how we got into the mess we're in, and the mess we're in. That's overphrasing it. There's a lot of great things happening in the church, but how we got into the certain messy places that we are. And then the middle third of it talks about the danger of numbers. But the last third says, okay, let's take a look at our way out of this. And one of the two chapters that makes that turn is entitled "Integrity is the New Competence." And the argument that I make in the chapter is, for 40 years, we've been teaching competence. We've been teaching managerial expertise. We've been teaching entrepreneurialism and trying to get our numbers up. And in the meantime, during those 40 years, the church has lost credibility at the fastest rate that we've ever seen. I don't believe we've lost credibility because of these systems and because of this entrepreneurial spirit. But parallel to the entrepreneurial approach, we have had moral failing after moral failing after moral failing after moral failing. It's almost a weekly headline now, to the point where we have lost the trust of the American people faster than we've ever lost it before. And The Great De-Churching is a book that shows the stats behind this, so that it's not just me saying this. We are losing people at a record rate. And here's the deal. So what we're looking at is, we want to keep this management approach going. Okay, how can we do better strategies to get them back? How can we have better ideas to bring them back? How can we be more entrepreneurial and bring them back? You don't bring people back through entrepreneurial spirit when you've lost them because of a lack of integrity. You will not talk to a single person who says, I've deconstructed or am deconstructing my faith, or whatever term they use. You won't find a single one of them who says, I left the church because, well, their management stuff just wasn't up to speed. That video was kind of cheesy, so I'm not going to follow Jesus because they got cheesy videos. No, nobody's leaving the church because our videos are cheesy. They're leaving the church because they can't trust us anymore. So we're not going to manage our way out of our problems. We have to restore integrity again. We have to be people of our word. That's why they're leaving. And that's the only thing that's going to keep them or bring them back.
No, got you. So that was my next question. You answered it, is how do we get that back? Just do what you say and be who you're supposed to be and be genuine about that.
Yeah. I put it in a simple steps in the book. I put it in simple steps like this. To restore our integrity, here's the steps you need to take. 1, you need to do the right thing. 2, you need to do it every time. And 3, you need to do it for a long time. And then finally, you need to do it with no agenda. Do the right thing every time for a long time with no agenda. That's the only way that I know to restore trust again. And then when you do fail and you do the wrong thing and you don't stand up for it, then truly repent of it. Not with I'm sorry you were offended, but no, I'm sorry I did something offensive. I was wrong. I repent of this. And now I'm going to do the right thing every time for a long time. And then that last one is where I get the pushback with no agenda, right? Well, isn't the agenda the gospel? No, the gospel is the ultimate anti-agenda. I'm doing the right thing, not so I can get my numbers up. I'm doing the right thing because it's the right thing, even if it loses me somebody.
That's good.
No agenda.
You brought a good point up about do the right thing for a long time and continue doing that. For the new pastor that's coming into a church that's not healthy, because we get those calls, we talk to a lot of people about that. Hey, I'm at this church now. There's a lot of things I need to change. Where do I start? And I think that's the point right there. You got to build trust.
Yeah.
If you're trying to make changes and if the church is unhealthy, a lot of times those changes are going to be hard changes that are going to offend somebody and something they've been used to. And it's not what they need to be doing, but you got to build that trust before you move into that. And so, like you said,
and the smaller the church is, the more important that is. In a large church, there's a sense of, if you're walking into a church of a couple thousand, well, you're going to do what the pastor says, because we know we're not going to have a survey for everything. I'm not going to have a chance to talk to the pastor. So I either agree with what the pastor does and I stay, or I disagree with the direction the pastor's taking the church and I leave. But that's pretty much what it is. But the smaller the church is, the more there's this dynamic interplay between the pastor and the congregation, and a conversation and a relationship and a trust building that happens between the pastor and congregation that is absolutely essential before you can begin to move anything forward. In the big churches, they talk about, setting the culture, that the pastor sets the culture. Well, here's the deal. In a small church, the pastor doesn't set a culture. In the small church, the pastor inherits a culture.
Amen to that.
So you need to understand what that culture is, and you need to show them the things you appreciate about the culture, because until they get that you get them, you're not taking them anywhere.
Amen.
But if they look around and go, oh, he understands it, he gets us, he knows what we're all about, that takes time.
Yep.
In my church, I was here for 7 years before I dared to make any really big changes. We made some, incremental changes. We took we put guitars instead of pianos on the platform. And if anybody thinks that's a small change, you haven't tried to do it. But in the big picture of what the church is all about, those are actually secondary changes. They're big issues to push through, but they're actually secondary changes. But by the
Putting
time
things
we
on
were
the
really,
stage is easy. Taking them off is hard.
yes,
Yeah,
oh
putting it
my
on
goodness.
is no problem. We don't mind adding. We can't take away.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we didn't really get around to really big issues of, okay, who are we and what are we called to do and who are we called to reach and what changes are we willing to make in order to go where God wants us to go. I didn't even begin to bring those things up until year 5, 6, and 7.
Wow.
And
That's
at the
good.
point when we started making those suggestions, I overheard and was told about multiple conversations where people said, I don't know if we should do this, because my church had been through 5 pastors in the 10 years before I showed up. So they were not going to jump on anything real quick, because that 5 pastors in a row had pitched a big vision and then left before it even got started. So I just said, I'm going to be patient here. And by the time it was 5, 6, 7 years and we started really asking these serious questions, there were conversations of, I don't know, could we do this? I mean, he's going to stick around. And they looked at and then he's been around for 6 years. And he gets the feeling of this church, and he's open to the conversation, and he's one of us now. We're in this together. This is not some guy from the outside coming in as an expert. He's one of us at this point. But I had to establish that. And the smaller the church is, the more important that is.
And I think one thing what you're just hitting on, and I think why it's going that way, I think trust it's huge. And I think in the era in which we're in, whether it's news media, some of these larger ministries, I think we pay the price for it. And some of it, like, see, my mom, my testimony is unique. My mom actually got saved watching Jim and Tammy Baker. So that's my story. And it's wonderful. Yeah. People don't think it, but when ministries like that through the years fall, regardless, even small church pastor, but I do think we can do it. And I used to think I think the years they tell you go to a church, it used to be 2 years. You know, I think it's 5 years, or if it's more now, like you just said, before you really begin to learn the people. But this is my second church that I pastored another church for 5 years. Things I did there successfully, I tried to do plug and play. So, hey, it worked there. Let's do this. And I come here with these ideas. And when I say really trying to put, a square peg in a round hole, I frustrated myself because wait a minute. All we got to do is I got to make these phone calls, these connections, and basically I can resurrect here what I was doing there. And it was like the Lord just kept telling me, just stop. You're in a different place, a different culture, different people. Get to know them first. And so I think what you really hit the nail on the head. In a smaller church, it's so much more intimate. There may be things I could hide in a larger ministry and not be as vulnerable, I guess. But when I walk in and, I'm the one shaking hands, or like me, I used to call it the Brian and Jessica show. It was me and my wife doing everything, hey, back to you, Jessica, kind of back to you.
Oh, I know.
You can't really hide behind other people or bigger things. But so my number one factor in being unsuccessful is trust. I say, hey, this is who we are, or hey guys, I blew it. I thought this would work, or you know what, man, I shouldn't have done that. I apologize. I shouldn't have raised my voice like that. There's a lot that the Lord had to continue to work on me. But I do think we do miss it. Like you're saying in your book, the integrity and the trust of a pastor will outlive any dynamic sermon on Sunday morning, or even what you said, a cheesy video. It's amazing. And I tell people, it's amazing. We sometimes talk about our people, but it's amazing what they will put up with a pastor who they think is genuine and they really trust them. They'll sit there and they'll listen to some horrible sermons, some cheesy jokes, even sometimes respond to the altar service just to give me, I guess, a little bit of compassion to say, here, let's just go, even though we really don't feel it, just to make him feel good today. And but that goes a long way when you're building and doing ministry with your people and not trying. I think your word agenda is what really resonated with me. My only agenda is I love you and I want to try to build this church. And I think that's very powerful, what you were saying.
Yeah. What you're talking about, this is the reason why I named my podcast The Church Lobby, because I've discovered the smaller the church, the more this is true. Mm-hmm. You can discover more about the health of a church by walking through the lobby than by watching what comes from the platform. Okay, because
We
it
didn't
comes
have
from
a
the
lobby.
platform.
I'm
What's
sorry.
that?
I was going to say, we didn't have a lobby when I came to my church. It was a
Yeah.
small hallway that led in. That was one of the first things we did, was took out 2 offices and
There you go.
created an area for people to mingle outside. And there's a lot of Sundays I have to turn the lights out. All right, y'all, somebody's locking the door other than me.
Yep. Yeah. We're the same way. We've got a very narrow lobby. It's it's the old style of church where they built a sanctuary 10 times the size of the lobby. Today, if you look at any new churches being built today, the lobby is at least the same square footage as the main sanctuary, at least that big.
Yep.
Now, thankfully, I live in Southern California, so we built a lobby outside. We've got the patio, and that's our lobby because we're limited in square footage for all kinds of weird things here in Southern California. But the lobby skills are really important. And the smaller the church is, if your lobby skills are good, if your people skills are good, if you remember people's names after they've shown up once and they come the second time, they will love you, they will stick with you, and the church will be healthy, even if your preaching isn't as good as you wish it could be. Because here's the deal. They can get better preaching on their phone, but they can't get a pastor who knows them and loves them unless they show up and walk through the lobby.
Amen.
So we have to get better at our church lobby skills.
Oh man, that is some great information. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have, I'm gonna take a lot of that to heart. I try to spend a lot of time talking with mine out there. That's that time to connect. And I was told early on, when you see people lingering after a service, whether or not you felt like you did a good job, that's a good sign.
Yep, absolutely, huge.
And so, man, I really appreciate it. I want to let everybody know, if you want to find out more about what Pastor Karl has, you can go to karlvaters.com. Look at all of his books. He's got a lot more to offer than just desizing church. I really recommend this one from all sizes, even large churches. I didn't ask before. I want to ask real quick, are you getting any feedback from larger churches that they're applying some of these principles and getting?
Yeah, it's beginning. Just recently, for instance, I was asked to come and do a consultation at a multi-site church, and they were doing the big stuff well. Their phrasing was, we're doing Monday through Saturday well. We know how to pull the whole team together and work as a church. But on Sunday, when 1,400 people go to 7 different sites and 2 meetings per site, that's an average of 100 people in the room. When you've got 100 or fewer people in the room, these pastors who were brought in from larger church context for this multi-site thing, they didn't know how to react. So each site has an on-site pastor who preaches that Sunday. So they're trying to get the value of the small, but they're all pastors who came out of a big context, and they don't know things like how to walk through the church lobby. So one of the pastors, for instance, was talking about how he, spends his time in the green room between services. And I'm like, green room?
Wow.
You got 40 in the first service, you got 70 in the second service. You're intentionally making it small, and you're spending your time in the green room. He says, well, that's what I was taught. You got to break between services to, collect your energy and get away from the crowd. And I went, crowd? You don't have a crowd. I said, here's the deal. In a church of under 100, in a church of over 1,000, the green room is an escape from the crowds, because walking through the lobby just drains you, and you're not making real connections anyway. It's just people who want a selfie with the star. That's all that is. Okay.
Right.
But if you're got 40 people in one service and 70 in the other service, and you're spending your time in the green room, you are avoiding your pastoral responsibilities. Get out there in the hallway, and they're writing it down like crazy and looking at each other like they never heard it before, because they hadn't. Because the rules in a big church context are different. So the rules in a small church are not scaled down rules from the big church. They're a different way of pastoring altogether. And there's a beginning to be an understanding of that. And I'm beginning to receive calls from larger contexts, like the big, conference that I talked about, like the multi-site church. So that to me is a real good sign that people are paying attention to the idea that, hey, there may be healthy small churches that we can learn from, even in a big church context. That to me is a real positive step.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to make sure we got across is, as smaller churches, we're always learning from the bigger churches. But I want to make sure that if a big church pastor is watching this, listening to it, like, these are things that you can learn from, that you can apply, and so make sure you follow through with that. Right.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is it don't have to be the big versus small. Because I think when you share the statistics, whether it's 90 and 10. We all have a seat at the table. We all have our purpose, and we all have a thing. And I share this a lot with various people. Some of my greatest encouraging moments come from big church pastors. That one guy, I mean, he literally said, I don't know how you do it. He said, because basically I have a staff. He said, and you're doing, even if it's on a smaller way, you're doing everything, or your family or a few volunteers, y'all are pulling off everything in the church within, just a few. And he, but they also invited me to conferences he would go to. Hey, I'll buy an extra ticket if you want to go, come on with us, So it was never, I've never had the big versus small. I just feel like we all have a seat at the table. And, but I do know, like I said, well, I started off earlier, myself, I can be defensive, but it's like you said, the grasshopper myth. But the same thing I think sometimes can come from the bigger church, where if I'm trying to celebrate small church, that don't mean I'm criticizing big church.
Nope.
I can celebrate one without throwing shade on the other. I don't know if you have a moment just to speak to that. I'm sure you deal with it.
Yeah. No, that's huge. My only concern, my only worry about this ministry that I do of helping small churches thrive is that in any way I will come across as being anti-big, because the last thing we need is one more division in the body of Christ. That's right. I think we're full up with those. We got, there's a no vacancy sign on conflict in the church. We're plenty. So I really want to be able to emphasize that. And yeah, I think we need to switch it from big learning, small learning from big only, to unhealthy learning from healthy. Now, within that, unhealthy big churches are going to learn more from healthy big churches. And unhealthy small churches are going to learn more from healthy small churches, because there is a difference in the way they're pastored. But that doesn't mean that that's exclusively it. Unhealthy big churches can also learn from healthy small, and unhealthy small can also learn from healthy big. But it should be primarily healthy to unhealthy rather than from big to small.
That's good.
Amen. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. Look, I always like to end with this, and would love to take the opportunity, if you wouldn't mind, speaking to the life of a first-time minister, somebody that's really getting out on this journey, that instead of trying to fix some problems, maybe you can give them some advice to start out fresh, to start out right. And so if you would just take just a second and pour into them just a minute or two before we close the episode.
I appreciate that opportunity. Yeah, for those who are new in ministry, yes, seek to go where you're going. Seek to understand where God is taking you. But even more than that, appreciate where you are. Appreciate where God has put you. Jesus did not wake up this morning depressed by the size of your church. He put you where he put you for a reason. You are in that spot on purpose. Jesus knows the number of people you have and don't have, the number of resources you have and don't have, and he's not worried about it. There's nobody who would pick up a Bible and do a simple, honest reading of it and get to the end of Scripture and go, oh, this is about getting more people in the room. No, that's never what it's been about. So appreciate where you are, and then you will be able to lead them to a better place in a healthy way. But if you don't appreciate where you are right now, wherever you go will not be a healthy place. Start where you are, appreciate where you are, and then move them to a place that God wants to take them for the future. But appreciate the starting point first. That's always the best place to begin.
That's an awesome word. Thank you so much for being a part. Brian, thank you for joining in on the conversation and being here with us today. Pastor Karl, thank you so much for all that you're doing, pouring into small church pastors, writing these books, sharing at the conferences that you have. Maybe one day we can get you back over this part of North Carolina again sometime soon. I'd love to talk to you about that later sometime, about what we can do. So thank you again, guys, for being a part of everything.
Thanks, guys.
And thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. We hope that everybody has a great day. Do us a favor, like, subscribe to the channel, and let's help us get this word out. Hope you have a great day.